Sorry, so Stephanie, you were saying again about boy, like that got cut out. So can you please continue with that again?
We've never done this before to children. We've never said to a little boy, yes, you are really a girl, and to a girl, yes, you are really a boy, as if that was possible. We're not telling children it's impossible to change sex, and pre-pubertal children don't understand themselves as sexed beings yet. But we never had to do that. This has been going along with legislation where we have to now say that a transsexual male adult is actually a woman. So that's gone along with the politics. But to say that to children, they can have no possible understanding of what that actually means and the nuances of it. To a child, yes, of course a boy can be a girl. It's as simple as that. And they have absolutely no idea of the treatments involved, the effects of the treatments, the surgery. I remember seeing a news report where a 6-year-old girl was saying, the doctor can make me a penis. And I'm thinking, no, the doctor can't. A child cannot understand what is involved, with this journey. And the life of a transsexual person, the child cannot understand that. So it's treating children as if they're mini adults. And that's not fair. We should not be doing that to children.
And, you're talking about this, and I don't know if it came out so clearly, but you were talking about the fact that by using hormone blockers, you're preventing them from going through the natural psychosexual stage of puberty. And so in your chapter, you talk about that they're kind of in a permanent state of arrested development, so to speak. They never went through that stage.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
We're keeping children as children. So, most children don't come off that medical pathway once they're on it. Most progress to cross-sex hormones. But even if they did desist, a boy who started taking blockers at tennis stage 2, say 11 or 12, and then desisted at age 15 or 16, I think it takes a year for puberty to kick in after blockers anyway. Is he going to develop in the same way as he would have done if his puberty was at the correct time, his development? It's a huge experiment here because things happen at the right time. And if we interrupt, then we don't actually know whether puberty does resume in the same way. I mean, it can't really, a few years on. But the fact is we don't have the numbers to study that because so few children actually do come off blockers once they start.
Yeah, and there's also a sense that desistance, as you mentioned before, the numbers vary, but it's something like, 80% of kids who have a cross-sex identification as young children will desist and come to be happy in their natal bodies. And that usually happens during puberty. And there's a sense that probably the surge of endogenous hormones at puberty is what allows for the brain to kind of get rewired. And Stephanie put it, it's the psychosexual development that helps the child align with their natal sex. So by blocking puberty, we think that there's a real chance that we're closing the door on the possibility of desistance.
And trans activists or trans positive people would say, well, that's great because they turned it around. That's saying that desistance would be a non-natural state, that you're interfering with their natural progression. This is the Orwellian language that we're talking now. And too many professionals are afraid to speak out because they do face professional censure. And that's the scary part. And that's why I've been making these videos. I've got no skin in the game. My children are not trans. I've only worked with a few trans patients and, I know a few trans people. I'm not an activist. I just get very concerned when we're dealing with such equivocal yet such drastic types of conditions and remedies. As you're saying, it's a social experiment and we're experimenting on young children.
And of course, young children believe adults and the trusted adults, the parents, the teachers. If those adults are all telling a child, yes, you're really a girl, then you are building up that fear of the puberty that will make the child into the wrong sex according to now what the child believes. It seems to me it's two sides of the same coin. On one side you shame and humiliate and you try and make that little boy macho, and it's the other side of the same coin. You affirm and you say, yes, you really are a girl. Both ways are really quite, to me, extreme ways to childhood behaviour and quite normal developmental behaviour of children. Even if it's quite extreme, it's not unheard of for children to believe that they are the opposite sex. And there seems to be no sort of holding space for those children as freely as possible. I don't think there should be on either extreme. of adult intervention and adult influence on a child, because that influence will affect the outcome. It can't not.
Right. And so I just want to kind of transition into each of your chapters here. And Stephanie, I'm going to start with you just because that's what you're talking about. In a nutshell, I mean, you focus mostly on girls in your chapter, and you've taken a look at what this whole movement is doing with respect to our conceptualization, not even ours, but what we're teaching children about what it means to be a boy or girl. You just alluded to that. So can you kind of just sort of summarize that and say what is the kind of the main thrust of the chapter?
I wanted to look at the cultural changes, and I took my point when Louis Theroux did a documentary called Transgender Kids in April 2015, because I'd been sort of noticing the increase in the media over the previous few years. I thought, that's it. Now it's gone mainstream, and that's what happened. That's the year that there was double the numbers referred to the Tavistock over that year, which is an April to April year. Louis Theroux's documentary was at the start of it. So I wanted to sum up the change in just those 2 years and the spread of this very, very rigid ideology into schools, across organisations, and that influence on kids of the youngest ages, that everybody is giving them the same story. And this is the new reality, that the difference between boys and girls now is not sex, it's gender identity. And that's the distinction. That's what tells you if you're a boy or a girl. And biology doesn't any longer exist. It has no relevance. So I just wanted to track the development of that message and how that's been spread to children, and also how children are likely to understand that message.
So in a nutshell, for someone who says, so what's wrong with saying that it's all about the identity, the gender identity, not about the physical sex? What's your answer to that when they say, why aren't you on board with this?
Because when children fully mature, and that happens around the mid-20s, they'll realise it's not true, that actually sex is important. And when it comes to dates, I saw was a video of a young trans woman, sort of early 20s, hanging out on a beach, meeting guys, swap numbers, lots of flirting. And then the video in her bedroom saying that the guy had dropped all contact with her when he found out that she was trans. And I just thought, did nobody tell you that straight guys don't want girls with penises? It is important, and we're lying to children if we say that sex is not important. For the vast majority of people, it certainly is.
Okay, and they're going to say, but that's just because they're transphobic. And now they're attacking gays and lesbians here. If you're a woman and you're into women, yet you don't like a woman who happens to have a penis, you're a transphobe. So why can't you get on board with that?
Yeah, and you're obsessed with genitals. Mm-hmm. You're cis-normative.
Right. Mm-hmm. And that's the irony. I see this all the time when we deal with certain factions. Any extremist on either side or any side of a spectrum, it's this notion of projection where they can't accept what they themselves are doing, so they accuse everybody else. They're saying, you're obsessed with genitals. No, I think you guys are, the people who are talking about this are obsessed with genitals. That's all they talk about. And so I want to use that to talk about with Lisa. In your book, Lisa, to me, there was sort of two main parts of it. In your chapter, sorry. One part is, it was just so beautiful, where you take a D.W. Winnicott and a Carl Jung conceptualization. We'll talk about that, of identity and all that you get into that. But then the second part was also where you talk about this compendium of all these different people. But when you talked about the healthy way of dealing with whatever they were dealing with versus the unhealthy, which is this obsession with gender, that's all they talk about, and how unhealthy that is. So can you please just sort of summarize the part about this whole idea of like what you're postulating is behind this whole transgender rush in many people? Because I think it's fascinating.
And so it is sort of a very bedrock belief that I have, that we all have an unconscious that influences us. And this, of course, is sort of the soul of psychoanalysis. That's the bedrock assumption of Freud and of Jung, and it's been around for a long time now. And by the way, it's also being borne out by, neurobiology, that yes, there actually are things that we are not conscious of that influence us every second of our lives. And, when I first came across this and learned that there was this sort of psychotherapeutic protocol that was the order of the day that required us not to question, not to explore, but just to affirm. Well, that sort of flies in the face of psychodynamic psychotherapy. That's what we do. We explore, we question, we hold space for, we try to open it up and sort of peel off layers of the onion. One of the basic assumptions of psychodynamic psychotherapy is that it's not about what it's about. If someone walks into your office and they say that they're angry at their husband over money, I mean, yes, that might be true, right? But we're also thinking, well, and what else is there? What's behind that? What's the larger story? What's the meta narrative? And of course, part of that is kind of coded language, because that's how the unconscious communicates, is through symbols. And so, if a young person comes out as transgender, I'm really curious about what's being grappled with symbolically, what's being grappled with in the unconscious, would be to try to hold it open so that could be explored.
Liminal space. I love your chapter. I think it's brilliant. Liminal, it's a lovely word.
And it is a word that by an anthropologist who was writing about rites of passage. And the significant numbers of people who are identifying as trans are in this stage of life, and they live in an indigenous culture. They would be helped to cross adulthood initiation rites. And so I sort of play around in my chapter with, is this a way to try to self-initiate?
People are going to say, no, this is all biological. It's, again, you're denying destiny versus, again, I think your chapter is brilliant where you're saying, what are they trying to understand about themselves? And here's the part, I want you to say it because I don't want to ruin it. A lot of people, when they talk about trans rights and gender pronouns and using whatever term they want you to address them by, a lot of people like to go then, well, what about other kin? What about somebody who believes that they are a fox or a crouching tiger or whatever? They say, are you going to start calling them, Tigger or Winnie the Pooh? You, in the chapter, talk about the difference between the literal and the liminal, or the space in between.
I think the example that I gave in the chapter is that in some cultures, in some shamanic practices, the shaman will change form and become an eagle and fly, and that this is understood to have a sort of psychic reality, right? I mean, to the shaman, it's very real, and yet it is in this kind of liminal, ritual, symbolic space, and it is actually healing and transformative. But when you see, okay, well, now I'm really an eagle. I mean, the shaman is standing before you, and he may be saying, yeah, when I do that, I'm an eagle. But in some sense, he also recognizes his or her, women can be shamans too, material reality in human form. And so I was talking about other kin, and some people who identify as other kin will undergo really extraordinary, multiple surgery to change their bodies to look like an animal. And to me, that seems like a concretization of a symbolic process. And by extension, I'm saying that I think sometimes identifying as transgender is exactly that kind of concretization of something that should be held in a symbolic space.
And I think that is so important. And again, I want to be very clear. If a professional were to try to say, okay, well, what is this possibly representing? Let's not be literal here. Let's not say that the boy literally needs to become a physical girl. Let's find out. Maybe they're trying to access the anima of themselves, the feminine part of themselves, that they want to have a balance. Mm-hmm. They don't want to be a macho. And this is what you were saying, Stephanie, earlier about, right? Yeah. So maybe they're struggling, whether it's about sexual identity or just about being, the type of person. If you have a very strong macho father and he wants you to be this way and you're a boy, but you'd rather be an artist or something, trying to understand that. As soon as you do this, what I consider to be a very rational, humane, and classic approach, understand those layers as you're talking about. As a therapist, you can get in trouble. Different states, different provinces, different countries have different laws around this. And this is insane. It's political.
Mm-hmm. Very quickly, there's never just one diagnosis, there's never just one interpretation, but the issue of trans kids seems to be set apart from everything else. All of our knowledge and all of our wisdom, everything that we know is irrelevant when it comes to a transgender child. So to me, that means that all protections have been taken away from these kids.
Ironically, because it's not in their best interests, yet they claim they are.
Somebody, I think that's a really great point. I think, in some ways that might be like the headline, that this is treated unlike anything else.
And so from your experiences, I know how I see it, but how do you then interpret the fact that this one phenomenon has become so, you can't touch it? How did it get to that stage? Or that state? So
many different factors. But I think we do believe in those gender stereotypes that, a little girl is somebody who likes pink and princesses. A little boy is somebody who likes fighting and being a leader. I think we actually really do. And I think our culture has really, certainly in this country, the toy industry, children's clothes and books, even, little girls' clothes are hypersexualized. And this has happened only over the past decade. that they have become so extreme into sort of gender and sex role stereotypes. And I really think that's had a big part in this. I can really understand why a little boy would say, well, you know, I like this stuff, girls, I must be a girl. I mean, it's so obvious, and that message is coming to him everywhere. Even if the parents are not reinforcing it, the rest of the culture is. It's become so extreme and relentless. And of course, you've got TV advertising, and all those messages are coming a lot faster. But I think all of that conditions the parents as well. I think it's not just the kids who are really believing those stereotypes. I think it does the same to parents. You don't notice it happening, but it sort of becomes automatic that you buy the little girl and you buy the matching blue or macho one for your boy. And it's sort of self-perpetuating until we all don't quite realise what's happening. You have to make, even if you are aware, you have to make a real effort not to say to a girl, oh, that's so pretty, or to a boy, oh, you know, you're so strong. Even I have to concentrate to do that because they're so insidious, those dreams.
So a few things. I've got 3 daughters, and I always say this. I don't raise them to be 3 girls. I raise them to be 3 strong, self-loving, loving, compassionate, self-efficacious humans. Gender rarely comes in. I mean, of course, it's relevant at some point, but when I talk about their schoolwork or their piano lessons or anything else like that, it's not about gender. It's about who you are as a person. And I say that my mother opened up Canada's first sex store in 1972. I teach human sexuality. I am the last person you can call a prude. I am very open sexually and everything else like that. But I also know that for most people, that whole idea about sexuality and everything, if it's introduced too early, before a child can process it, they're going to get the wrong lessons. It's going to have this negative effect that we are seeing. So I think there is value in what you're saying about how this is playing into this whole trans mess that we're in.
And it is everyone. And of course, the internet, we haven't got onto that, and the internet and internet porn. And I think that the culture that girls are growing up in, I've got a teacher who's so shocked and worried about the number of girls who are really frightened about having sex ever and about becoming women. And there's the whole sort of perfection that girls have to be groomed to within an inch of their lives now just to be acceptable enough to walk out of the house. They're all, what's the word, depilated, and you know, the bar is set so high for girls. You know, young girls always, you know, wore a load of makeup and that, but you see this foundation on their faces now, and they're made up like sort of middle-aged women, and in a very conventional way that they're presenting themselves. And those kind of, you know, you see on TV, on the internet, Instagram, selfie culture, you know, you've got to look perfect. So girls growing up in the culture now, they don't feel that they meet that impossibility. They've already been taught to sort of almost disassociate from their bodies, to look at them from the outside and judge them and want to change them because they're not good enough. It's like girls are already primed into that sort of disconnection from their bodies and not inhabiting their bodies and feeling comfortable with their bodies as, you know, the vehicles that they get around the world and what they can do, but it's all about how they look. So I think the culture plays a big part in creating a generation that's almost primed to accept that their bodies can be wrong, the wrong body, and that their real self is some sort of spirit that is disembodied. I think they've already sort of been primed into that idea.
Right. And when you talk about porn and everything for teenagers, no, it's well before teenagers. That's the thing, that people are accessing it before they're prepared to process it properly. And I always tell people, they're seeing these messages, a lot of sexualization. It's not about empowerment. Here's the greatest myth that has been promulgated, is that early exposure and frequent exposure is somehow empowering people. It's not, because kids believe in Santa Claus or whatever else it is. They can believe in things that are not real. They don't have the critical thinking ability. So they're just getting all this information and they're just, you know, scratching the surface. They're not understanding. They're not seeing empowering messages. Women are not empowered in these videos. They're getting a very wrong message. And I want to go back. I want people to understand this. When you do talk about women trying to look beautiful or men trying to measure up, 2 things. One thing that internet porn has done is it's leveled the playing field. Now, young men are just as anxious ashamed, scared, fearful as young women because, first of all, they know that these girls and women are able to admit that they watch these things or that they've had multiple partners, so they're being compared. Before, a woman wouldn't say that. They wouldn't say, oh, you're the worst I've ever had in 20 people or that I've seen on videos. There was no bar. So there's a lot of anxiety there, number one. And number two, I think what people haven't fully digested is, again, this whole idea about the culture of beauty or unrealistic standards and so on has always been there. But historically, you looked at a model, you looked at an actor or actress or something like that, and the children could have a little space in their mind where they sort of realize, okay, I don't measure up to this, but they're not real people. They're, these actors, whatever. But now with Instagram and everything else like that, it's everybody. It's not an actor or this tiny percentage. It seems that the whole damn world is looking a certain way or is acting a certain way.
Yeah.
And that has a huge impact on people's psyche and their self-image because they can't measure up to the rest of the world. That's what I think people are really failing to recognize.
And I think you're right. The pressure on boys has really grown over the last decade as well. Just gym culture. I think in some ways it adds to the girl because these boys are pumping up and getting really macho, which actually adds to girls' insecurity. Like, this is so extreme macho. They're like cartoons, men and women. And how do you cross that gap from one to the other when they're that extreme? So that connection between men and women, it seems to have driven that apart. And there's not an easy way to cross that gap. And I'm not saying all kids are like this, by the way, because I know that it's not all like that. But I think what it does is it affects the vulnerable kids.
And we do see that, a lot of trans people, a lot of SJWs, social justice warriors, they are the misfits. They are the vulnerable people, right? And in the old days, they may have been goth. They might have been a metalhead. They might have been something else, looking for an identity. It goes back to what Lisa was saying about whether it's a right into passagehood or right into the next stage of development as a teen or individuating from your parent. Because in the child that you mentioned, Michaela to
Mitch,
right?
Yeah.
Well, I'll let you talk about that, please. And we're running out of time, but can you just kind of talk about that this whole idea of trying to find herself or himself, why that was so important?
I mean, there were a few themes that came up. And one of them was, I'll just sort of stick with Michaela, that she and her mother were very close and that this may have been a way for this young woman, I think she was 14 or 15, to separate from her mother. I mean, that's quite a way to separate from your mom, right? I'm so that I'm not even a woman, I'm not even going to grow up to be like you. At the same time that it allowed her to separate, it also kind of kept her close and infantilized a little bit because she was so distressed that, she was having trouble at school and there was a lot of kind of care and concern directed toward her. And I see this a lot with these kids that in some ways they become regressed. They don't get their driver's license. Their parents demand less of them because they appear so fragile. Seems a way to both separate and put more distance between your parents, but also sort of stay close. And also, it winds up being a way of belonging. I mean, everyone really, but teens especially need to both feel that they fit in and stand out. Coming out as trans, if you're a teenager, helps you stand out and fit in because you have a new tribe that you fit in with, but you're also special.
Right, you're celebrated.
Yes.
I call it the need for integration and individuation. As a teenager, you're looking to integrate, to find your tribe, your community, and you're looking to individuate and stand out. It's the task of the teenage years. That's their job.
Yeah, exactly. And it should be a healthy process, and kids stumble through it. The funniest thing is the irony is they want to separate from their parents, they want to individuate, yet what do? They jump right into another tribe. They become a clique. Yep. And we're not just talking about trans kids. Every single child or most children go through that at adolescence. They become a shadow to somebody else or part of a group. They lose their identity.
And I think the misfits or the kids who don't fit in, the autism spectrum kids, the awkward ones, the ones that get bullied. I think the tribe that trans provides, and in the UK there's over 260 trans youth support groups who work very hard to get these kids to come and help you. It sounds so great, doesn't it? And everybody must support them, but there are no support groups for misfit kids. That there are no support groups for lesbians. There are no support groups for autistic kids or kids who just don't fit in. Nothing. So, but the trans groups provide that tribe, and it's very, very hard once you're in there having all that approval, having that acceptance, and then changing. It's a very, very hard thing to do, I think, once you've found that, because it's so important. So important. You have your tribe.
And that's the thing. If you look at some catchphrases over the last couple of years, more and more people are talking about tribalism, but not just for trans kids when we talk about identity politics. And people have to realize it's in our DNA. We need this tribe, the sense of belonging. And so I wish more parents would recognize, or more trans activists or whoever would recognize, that for so many of these kids, it really is just not just trying to find out who they are, but where do they belong? What tribe? And why are we pushing them into trans tribe just because it's trendy?
This is a normal part of teenage development. And the problem with transitioning is it hypostatizes it and makes it permanent. Experimentation is good. Permanent results of the experimentation, especially when it's things like sterility or amputation of healthy organs, not so good.
What the trans narrative has done, like it does with young kids, in the teenage years, what they've established is this new binary of trans, you're edgy, you're cool, you're different, you're unconventional. Cis, you're boring, you're conventional, you're ordinary. And that is absolutely entrenched, that idea. You don't want to be a boring cis kid if you've got any self-respect. I would have been in the trans camp. Definitely. You know, we're only providing one version of being unconventional, and that's somewhere under the trans umbrella, whether it's non-binary, whether it's gender fluid, whatever. You've got to be under the trans umbrella. There is nowhere else to go and be unconventional.
I just did it the old-fashioned way. I smoked, did drugs, got drunk, came to school hammered, listened to heavy metal, skipped school, made my parents' lives a mess, and made all my teachers' lives a mess. That was my way of being edgy. I've got to wrap it up because I do have a patient coming in. I'm so happy to have spoken with both of you. I'm so grateful, and I'm going to try to get more and more people from the book to speak about their own chapters, because each person adds another layer to something that's so important. And so if each of you, I'll start with Lisa, if you want to just kind of give your parting words of wisdom to the people who are watching this.
Sure. Well, I'm hoping that you will consider buying the book, and we'll put links in the bottom, and there's a discount code too. So that will be in the links. But I just want to say thank you very much for having us on.
Thank you. And Stephanie?
Thanks very much for having us on. And perhaps I'd just like to finish with anybody listening who is on one side or the other, that it's a really nuanced debate. Thanks for listening. And if you can take some of that away with you, the debate itself is crucial.
Yeah.
Right. And the funny thing is, I've been trying to avoid the word debate because there has to be a winner or loser. I've been trying to replace that with discussion. I build bridges. But you did bring the most important word, though. But Stephanie, you did bring it. You said it's nuanced. And far too many people are seeing it as something other than that. And especially this, it's win or lose, or edgy or boring, or trans or cis, or, hateful or loving.
Binary. All these binaries.
Right, exactly.
Binary.
Here's where we should be saying non-binary.
We have to hold the tension of the opposites. That's what Jung told us.
In a liminal space.
In the liminal space, exactly.
Right.
Thank you very much again for coming on. It's a really important book. It's a fascinating book. Each of your chapters was illuminating, and I do hope people will read them with an open mind. There's nothing hateful in these chapters or in this book. It's education, it's information, and we need much more of it, regardless of where on the spectrum you exist. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.